African nations have ordered curfews and lockdowns in response to the growing coronavirus epidemic, raising fears of turmoil for low-income workers and cash-strapped governments across the continent. Niger announced its first coronavirus fatality on Tuesday, alongside Cape Verde, after a 62-year-old British tourist died. Cameroon also recorded its first death, a man who had contracted the disease in Italy and tested positive on March the 14th. At least 4 people have died in Burkina Faso, which is West Africa's worst-hit country, with 115 confirmed cases. South Africa has the highest number of confirmed coronavirus cases in sub-Saharan Africa, and public health experts are worried that the virus could overwhelm the health system if infection rates rise steeply. For more on this, I'm joined by African analyst Tamsanqa Joe. There are almost 3,000 cases, confirmed cases of coronavirus in Africa. A third of them appear to be in South Africa. Why is this?
Well, it all depends on the way that what you call the index or offense happened. So in countries like South Africa, if it took some time for them to pick that up, by the time people go into quarantine, then there are already other people that are carriers. And also, you should realize that South Africa is a hub in terms of transport. So it's South Africa and a country like Ethiopia. These are countries where, the airports were always very busy. And these airports, the planes were coming from countries that were already affected. So you would expect that before any action could be taken, before the lockdowns were in place, there were already people who were carriers in the community.
The World Health Organization says the numbers on the continent are expected to be way higher than what's being reported. Do you think that's fair?
Well, it would be fair if it was a comparable statement to whatever happens. Just take the United Kingdom as an example. They have already said they have no testing capacity. So a lot of people that are already infected either don't know it or are being told to stay at home if what they have is just mild symptoms. And I cannot think of any country on earth except data that's coming from China that has capacity to do testing on a massive scale. These are just limited number of test kits, and there is a bottleneck because the entire world doesn't have enough testing kits. So you're trying to prioritize those people that are sick. You want to confirm whether what they have is the virus or not, and also healthcare workers. So you would expect that it's not just Africa, it's throughout the world. There is no country that I know of that is actually reporting figures of even the number of people that are infected. All they are doing is telling you, out of the people that have been tested, how many of those have actually tested positive. So I think whatever figures we have are an underestimate of what actually happens in those countries.
Yeah, fair point, Tamsanqa. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, he's asked for patience, courage and unity whilst he locks down 56 million people. There have also been lockdowns in several other African countries. The only difference is, Tam, we're sitting here in London and the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain has given or pledged £350 billion to support the economy. How are people in Africa supposed to be supported, especially when, the healthcare is in tatters?
Well, there are 4 things there, Juliana. The first is, I think, look at the central banks that you are looking at. In most cases, when you look at the G7, in particular, they were coordinating. The federal bank in the US Fed was extending facilities to quite a number of central banks around the world, even places like Sweden and Norway and Switzerland. They are offering, in Brazil, they're offering about 60 billion in terms of credit. So you would think that most of these central banks would have some room. And of course, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, 200 billion there, quantitative easing. So when it comes, and then that's why they were able to take down their interest rates. And the governments are doing this stimulus. In Britain, it's actually more than 330 billion. So what you see in Africa, you saw the Nigerian central bank maintaining the interest rates. When you talk about over 10 figure, anything north of 10, when everyone is, playing around, 0 to maybe 0.25% interest rate, that just tells you what base these countries have. But let's not underestimate the capacity in Africa, because Africa is used to working with epidemics. They have coped for several years with these things, villages and cities. People in Africa, from HIV to other things, Ebola, all these things have been happening in Africa over a long period of time. And Africa has a different way of coping culturally that does not necessarily look at the economics. So even if people are told there is no stimulus from governments that can equate to what's happening in the West, people can still find a way to survive. So one, it can safely say Africa will probably economically survive this better than the West, because the West is terrible. Because the banks, I know in Germany and France and places like that, what you call the buffer capital for the banks has actually been reduced in other cases to zero. How will those banks, move from there if everything that they have in their coffers is wiped? And how do you guarantee that savings you have in the bank, you will actually be paid? So it's going to be tougher for the West than it would be for Africa.
Of course, we know WhatsApp, social media is going into overdrive at the moment. And one of the huge issues I think a lot of the African communities are having are the false beliefs about whether or not coronavirus can affect you. What's your opinion on that? And do you think governments or diaspora leaders are doing enough to say that actually, this affects everybody? Stop being silly.
Maybe, Juliana, let me not give an opinion, but an appeal. And this will be an appeal to all the church leaders in Africa in particular, and even those that are leading diaspora communities that go to the churches. This is the time, I think, like people have done in the past, churches, communities, whatever their beliefs, when there is a problem, whether it's a war, whether it's an epidemic or a pandemic or whatever it is, people have always come together with one message. It must be a message to make sure that people are safe and they don't transmit this deadly virus. And also just making sure that people are supported if they start losing people or they start going into hospitals.